Introduction to doubly weak verbs. At this point, Ross takes a little bit of a diversion and looks at doubly weak verbs. Now, what are these? Well, as it states right there in the title, they are verbs that have two weak letters, usually the first and the last. So, if we have our radicals, our three radicals, we're talking this one and this one. And usually all three letters remain. They'll affect the vowels and things. Sometimes one or more will assimilate or drop. If they both drop, or they both disappear, or something happens to them, then you can get a situation where you only have one root letter left, which doesn't give you a lot to recognize the verb. So part of what we'll do in this chapter is to highlight some of the verbs for which this happens, so that at least when you see some of them, that you'll recognize them in the text, say, okay, that one must be one of my verbs that ends up with only a single consonantal form. And it gives you a fighting chance of finding it in the dictionary. So, but before we go into details here, I want to do an overview of weak verbs in Ross, just so you see where we've been and where we're going. The first thing we dealt with were gutturals. Gutturals appear, gutturals and aleph, okay, in different positions, first, second, third position. And actually, if you remember, you may not, but we started this way back in chapter 10. Chapter 10 was where we introduced the perfect tense, the perfect tense for the cal and strong verbs, and we looked there right away at first, second, and third gutturals. And then in chapter 17, when we introduced the imperfect, we also looked at second and third gutturals, and chapter 17 here, third aleph as well. So you may have forgotten that, but those were technically weak verbs. And then, of course, chapter 32, 33 is the whole section where we deal with the weak verbs that have gutturals in them. After that, we moved on to the first nun. And remember, lakach behaves as if it's first nun. That was chapter 34, and then chapter 35 was first vav. And remember, halach behaves as if it's first vav. And then, I just ignore these boxes for a moment. I'll come back to those. Those are our weak verbs, or our doubly weak verbs. First vavs, and then original first yuds. So these were both in the same chapter. And then we just finished third hey. Now we have two major sections left. We have what we call the hollow verbs. So skipping this chapter 37 for a moment, the one we're on right now, we have hollow verbs, chapter 38, and these are verbs that have a medial vav or a yud, right in the middle. And what happens is the vav and the yud often drop out in many forms, and so you end up with a hollow bit in the middle, hence the name. So a bit like a donut. You got the two end pieces and the middle is gone. So we'll look at those, and the other major type is our geminates. And geminates are ones where you have the second and third radical are the same. Geminate means twin, so you have twins there. Now, what we're doing right now in this chapter is looking at doubly weak verbs. So we're going to look at three types. They're all third hey. In the third position they have a hey. And in the first position they have either a guttural or a nun or a vav. Okay? And we're going to look at some. This is where you have the verb to be, haya, and the verb to live, chaya, which is almost identical to this, just with a different first letter. So this is where the verb to be shows up. I think I said earlier that it shows up in the third hey chapter, but it doesn't. It shows up in this chapter on doubly weak verbs. And again, I'll point out all our, not all, but I'll point out some key common verbs that drop both first and third radicals, so you only end up with one. Here's two I've put in here. Nata, and we'll come back to this again. Nata means to extend, and in some forms you end up with only this tate here. That's it. And naka means to attack, or in Old English to smite. And sometimes you have forms where you only have the kaf. So it's good to know those, and we'll look at some forms of these as well. Now we've actually already seen some doubly weak verbs, right? If you go back up here to chapter 34 in our first nun chapter, we saw natan. And natan was first nun, third nun. And we looked at that sort of as a category by itself because it was because it's very common, but it's also irregular because you have both of these nuns can drop off depending on what's happening. Drop off or assimilate. We also looked at yasha, which means to save, and it of course is first, well I shouldn't say of course, but it is a first vav and a third guttural. And what I did is I compared this with first vav verbs and third guttural verbs, and we saw that for the most part, the first part of the verb looked like first vavs, and the last part looked like third gutturals. No big surprise. And that's basically what we're going to find here as well. You're going to find verbs that look like one type on one end and another type on another end. And some of them get pretty messy. So that's why Ross has a chapter by himself on that. Or not by himself, but a chapter by itself for these doubly weak verbs. And if you think about it, haya has the verb to be in the middle, or has a yud in the middle, a mater. So this is really hey, yud, hey. I mean, that's almost triply weak. Okay, and then after we deal with this chapter, we'll go into our hollow verbs, and we'll deal with a couple of hollow verbs that could be viewed as doubly weak. Bo, which means to come or to enter. That's a very important verb, very common. And it ends with an aleph. It's two vav, second vav, and ends with an aleph, so it has some special features. So we'll look at that by itself. And nuach, which is where we get Noah's name from, means to rest. It also has a guttural at the end. This is aleph at the end, this is guttural at the end. They're both two vavs. So we'll look at those and see how they behave. And then finally, we have two geminates that we could view as doubly weak because they have two reishes, and reish doesn't double, of course, and two gutturals, and gutturals don't double either, so they're somewhat doubly weak. Okay, so that's where we've been, that's where we're going. Two major sections left, the hollow and the geminates, so you can look forward to coming to an end of weak verbs. And for now, in this chapter, we're going to look at these three, and I'll look at them in three different sets. So, on to the first guttural and third haze.